Well, I'm delighted to be with you. I think I have more to say than I have time to say it. And so I'm going to commit the cardinal sin of speaking quickly. But I'm going to try to compensate for that by speaking passionately. And so hopefully the combination of speed and passion won't interact in a bad way. Okay, I want to just very briefly. This story I discovered for the first time maybe a year ago, and it was so moving and so beautiful. And as I've learned more about it, I've become more moved. I can hardly talk about it without tears running down my cheeks. And so hopefully I can constrain my emotion as I tell you this story. And then I want to reflect a little bit on its implications for us as modern-day Jesus followers. Between 1939 and 1944, nearly 7 million Jews were exterminated by the Nazi government and its many, many collaborators. Historians estimate that there were between 100,000 and 250,000 so-called rescuers, those who risked their own safety and that of their loved ones in attempts to protect Jews from slaughter. These are thought to have saved as many as 250,000 Jewish lives. A great tragedy for European Christianity, however, is that these 100,000 to 250,000 rescuers comprised well under 1% of the European population of that time, a large majority of whom were professing Christians, who either actively collaborated with the Nazis or looked the other way and did nothing. I want to share with you this morning, though, the story of one small village of radical Jesus followers in southern France that didn't look the other way. I quote heavily from an utterly beautiful telling of this story by the philosopher Philip Halley in his now classic book, Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed. So take this in and enjoy. These are some beautiful stories. It was 7 o'clock in the evening of February 13th, 1943. Out of the car stepped two uniformed policemen, Major Silvani, the chief of police of the Department of Haute-Loire, and a lieutenant. Pastor André Trocme was away. It was his day of visits when, despite his bad back, he trudged across the countryside through thick snow to visit his parishioners. These visits, more than any other part of his ministry, made him trusted and beloved leader of the farming village of Le Chambon. His sermons were powerful, but these visits brought him into the center of the daily life of his people. In the intimacy of the home, his excitement and drivingly penetrating blue eyes drew his parishioners to him. Some of the homes he was visiting were the homes of the leaders of the 13 youth groups he had established in the parish in order to study the Bible in intimate groups. These groups and their leaders became the communication network and the moving spirits of a village committed to the cause of saving terrified foreigners from their persecutors. During the occupation, Trocme gave most of his instruction on the Bible and the resistance to these leaders as they sat in his somber office in the church. But it was necessary that he visit them individually as well in their homes. He had to be the only person in Le Chambon who knew about the entire rescue operation. He had to see to it that the groups operated as independently of each other as possible, so that if one leader were tortured, he could not reveal enough to destroy the whole rescue machine. The stakes were high. Germans had moved troops and administrators across the demarcation line into southern France and were known to have massacred entire villages suspected of resistance against the German occupying forces. Having heard the knock on the door, Magda Trocme, André's wife, sent the 4 Jewish refugees living with them to the attic and cellar to hide and open the door. Asked where her husband was, she said she didn't know and asked them to come in and wait for him in his office. The moment she and her husband had been expecting had finally arrived. After a couple of hours, Pastor Trocme came in, went into his office, and returned with this: "Magda, I am arrested." She cried, "But what about the suitcase of warm clothes we packed months ago? We've given the clothes away. The suitcase is empty." There they stood facing each other in dismay. She flew to their bedroom to pack a bag with clothes that might make the difference between life and death for her husband. He went up to the attic to explain to the Jews hiding there that the police were there for him, not for them, and to warn them not to come out, not to open any doors. The Trocmes had been invited to dinner that evening by a parish family, the Gilberts. The Gilberts' daughter came to remind them of the dinner engagement. They often forgot such invitations, it turns out. When she entered, she saw the police arresting her pastor, turned and flew from the house. In a little while, not only her parents, but many of the other villagers in this tight-knit community knew that André Trocme had been arrested. After the pastor and his wife rejoined them in the dining room, Magda Trocme invited the two policemen to have dinner with them. They sat down to eat, with the four Trocme children watching Major Silvani with great staring eyes of fear. When Magda offered him food, he told her that he did not have the heart to eat, and his face hung down almost to the plate in his misery. André, as was his custom, ate heavily, and even more than usual, just in case his imprisonment was as bad as he had heard it would be. In the course of the meal, he asked the chief of police why he was being arrested. Silvani answered, "I don't know. I know nothing. I can say nothing." And the dignified black-haired policeman was on the verge of weeping. Soon after the meal began, parishioners started coming into the presbytery to say their goodbyes to their pastor. Most of them were crying, and some of them had whispered criticisms to make of the police who were sitting there, heads bowed at the table. One of them, during a warm but shy embrace, whispered in the pastor's ear, "What harm have you done?" She, of course, knew of the false identity cards. She knew that they had been sheltering Jewish refugees and not registering them under their true names, and that this was in violation of the laws of France. But she also knew that sometimes, and this was one of those times, obeying the laws meant doing evil. As his parishioners embraced Trocme, they put into his hands precious packets. And after each group left, the minister brought these to the dining table. There were candles, which were all but unobtainable at this time. There were long-forgotten luxuries like sardines and chocolate biscuits. And there was one big sausage. There were warm stockings, and on top of the heat Trocme had made on the dining table, there was a roll of toilet paper, which was a precious gift in these poverty-stricken times, apparently. At first, the two officers watched all this with wide-open, amazed eyes, but as it went on and on, they seemed to crumple. And Silvani said, "I have never seen such a farewell, never." And he sat there, his head bowed, weeping over his untouched food. So distraught was he that never once did he pose the question that the police usually asked in the home of a Chambon villager, "Are there any Jewish refugees here?" Someone brought in a long, thin candle and handed it to Magda. After the giver had left, she said, "But where will he get the matches to light this?" Silvani walked up to her, the police officer, with a box of matches in his hand and said, "Please take these." Then he added, "I'll tell this story later. Yes, I'll keep it alive." Later in his report, he would describe the people of Le Chambon as full of love. He'd entered the village expecting violence, had cut off all telephone and telegraph communication between the village and the rest of the world, and had surrounded it with armed police guards. As the three walked down the street toward the high road that led to the village square, the gathered village followed behind. Someone in the crowd began to sing, and soon all had joined in the old Lutheran hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." The calm, deeply rooted song surrounded the three men, while the villagers closed behind them, and the clip-clop of their wooden shoes, muffled a little by the thin snow, followed them up the street. One day, after more than a month of incarceration, the three Protestants received a call to report to the office of the director of the camp. They thought perhaps they were being punished for leading discussions among the prisoners that dared to be critical of the occupation government, and that this might be the moment that they would be told they would be shipped to the death camps of Germany or Poland. When they arrived, they were told that they were being released, but that there was one formality, a certain paper they needed to sign. It had two parts. One exacted a promise to respect the person of our leader, Marshal Pétain. The other read, "I shall obey without question orders given me by governmental authorities for the safety of France and for the good of the national revolution of Marshal Pétain." The first part, Trocme and his co-pastor Edward Thies could sign without question. They respected the person of every human being. When Thies pointed out the second part with his finger, Trocmé, who typically spoke for both of them, replied, "We cannot sign this. We cannot sign this oath that is contrary to our conscience." The director of the camp then began shouting, "What is this? The oath has nothing in it contrary to your conscience. The marshal wishes only the good of France." Trocmé answered, "On at least one point we disagree with the marshal and his national revolution. He delivers the Jews to the Germans and thus to death. We are opposed to such action. When we get home, we shall certainly continue to be opposed, and we shall certainly continue to disobey orders from the government. How could we sign this now?" Regarding Trocmé's point about the French government delivering Jews to the Germans, in the fall of 1940, only a short while after the fall of France to Germany, the occupation government in Vichy, France, on its own initiative, but with an eye on its conquerors, took a census of foreign Jews in France. This immediately made the capture and deportation of Jews a simple bureaucratic procedure. The government had names and addresses, and the Jews were in their hands. In the first few days of October 1940, Jews were excluded from elected bodies, from the higher ranks of the civil service and the courts and the military, and from all positions that could wield a public influence. By the summer of 1942, about 20,000 Jews had been incarcerated in French concentration camps in southern France. By the time the war was over, the French occupation government had deported over 75,000 Jewish refugees to Nazi death camps. "Look," said the director, "be reasonable. I appreciate your courage, but look, you have wives and children, sign. It's but a formality. Later, no one will know what you did here. No one will care." Trocmé replied, "If we sign, we must keep our word. We must surrender our consciences to the marshal. No, we will not bind ourselves to obey immoral orders." "So be it," the director said. "You'll rot here indefinitely if the Germans don't deport you first. Take these men back to the barracks." The next morning, though, they were called back to the administration hut and greeted by the director himself. "I have good news for you," he said. "I have just had a telephone call. I am told to free you immediately without your signatures." They never found out why. When Trocmé and Thies stepped off the train back home at Les Chambon, there was the entire village waiting, with an open path through them. There was absolute silence at the railway station. Not a word was said. The two returning leaders had walked through the open path, and the villagers had silently closed behind them and followed them away in silence from the station. André Trocmé was born in 1901. He was a Reformed pastor, a conscientious objector, a fiery practitioner of a daring form of Christian nonviolent resistance, and co-pastor of the French Reformed Church in Le Chambon-sur-Lignon during those war years. A farming village in the mountains of south-central France, Le Chambon became a city of refuge to thousands of refugees, and over the course of the war rescued somewhere in the vicinity of 5,000 Jews from destruction at the hands of the Nazis. Trocmé and his assistant pastor, Edward Thies, at considerable personal risk to themselves and to their families, were the driving force behind these efforts, exhorting their people to live not in fear, but in Jesus' way of love. On June 22, 1940, France surrendered to the Nazis and agreed to arrest and deport to Germany any refugees Hitler's government might demand. The next day, during a Sunday service, Trocmé and Thies got up and preached one of the most powerful sermons ever. They said, "Tremendous pressure will be put on us to submit passively to a totalitarian ideology. If they do not succeed in subjugating our souls, at least they will want to subjugate our bodies. The duty of Christians is to use the weapons of the Spirit to oppose this violence that they will try to put on our consciences. We appeal to all brothers in Christ to refuse to cooperate with this violence. Loving, forgiving, and doing good to our adversaries is our duty. Yet we must do this without giving up, and without being cowardly. We shall resist whenever our adversaries demand of us obedience contrary to the orders of the gospel. We shall do so without fear, but also without pride and without hate. Their parish in Luchambon eventually came to host several thousands of refugees in houses funded by donations from all over the world. Also to host various operations to generate fake identity papers for Jewish refugees who could then hide in plain sight. They ran an underground railroad, smuggling refugees over the mountains into Switzerland, which was neutral. And dozens and what was the site of dozens and dozens of homes and farms that hid Jewish refugees in their attics and basements. And one poignant story told by Halley, the philosopher I mentioned earlier, from whom I'm quoting generously here, gives a sense of the heart of these people. It's a lovely story. Early in the occupation, a German Jewish refugee came to Luchambon, to a farm there, to buy some eggs on the gray market, and she was invited into the kitchen. Quietly, the woman who had invited her in asked, with light interest in her eyes, You are Jewish." The woman, who had been tortured for her Jewishness, stepped back trembling, and she became even more frightened when the farm woman ran to the steps leading upstairs and called up, "Husband, children, come down, come down." But her fright disappeared when then the woman added, while her family was coming down the steps, Look, my family, we have in our house now a representative of the chosen people." Another story from Halley gives a sense of the fire in these people's bellies. In the summer of 1942, a few months before German troops occupied southern France, the occupation government had sent the Secretary General in charge of youth affairs for a formal visit to Luchambon. All French youth then, 20 years of age, were required to spend 8 months in youth camps modeled after the Hitler Youth, down to the fascist salutes and the indoctrination in zealous patriotism and anti-Jewish racism. When the town had gathered for a meeting with this official, a dozen of the older students of the town school walked up to the official, handed him a document, and asked him to read it on the spot. Here's what that document said. "Mr. Minister, we have learned of the frightening scenes which took place 3 weeks ago in Paris, where the French police, on orders of the occupying power, arrested in their homes all the Jewish families in Paris. The fathers were torn from their families and sent to Germany. The children torn from their mothers, who underwent the same fate as their husbands. Knowing by experience that the decrees of the occupying power are, with brief delay, imposed on unoccupied France, we are afraid that the measures of deportation of the Jews will soon be applied in the southern zone. We feel obliged to tell you that there are among us a certain number of Jews. But we make no distinction between Jews and non-Jews. It is contrary to the gospel teaching. If our comrades, whose only fault is to be born in another region, received the order to let themselves be deported or even examined, they would disobey the orders received, and we would try to hide them as best we could." At this, the officer said, "These questions are not my affair. Speak to the prefect of your department." And he hurried away and left. The prefect in attendance turned to Trocme, whose fault he figured this was, and said, "Pastor Trocme, this day should have been a day of national harmony. You sow division." To which Trocme replied, "It cannot be a question of national harmony when our brothers are threatened with deportation." 2 weeks later, the authorities struck. The chief of police came to Trocme and said, "We know in detail and suspect activities to which you are devoted. You are hiding in this commune a certain number of Jews whose names I know. I have an order to lead these people to the prefecture for a control," which Trocme knew meant deportation for these people. "You are therefore ordered to give me the list of these persons and their addresses, and you will advise them to be on their good behavior so that they try not to flee." Trocme replied that he did not know the names of these people, which was true. He was absolutely against lying. They all had false identity cards, and Trocme did not want to know their real names. He went on, "But even if I had such a list, I would not pass it on to you. These people have come here seeking aid and protection from the Protestants of this region. I am their pastor, their shepherd. It is not the role of a shepherd to betray the sheep confided to his keeping. Trocme then returned to his office and sent emissaries to the outlying farms to warn the Jews to flee to the woods, which they did. Over 2 weeks of searching by the Gestapo and related authorities turned up just a single prisoner who sat alone in a bus among several buses as the entire village came out to comfort this person and let him know that they were supporting him. And through the crowd walked Andrew Trocme's son with his last bit of chocolate in these war-rationed, food-scarce days, and handed it up in the bus to the lone man sitting there. At which point, one by one, each of the villagers followed him and handed up their last bits of food, so that by the time they were done, he was surrounded by a pile of food as tall as he was. These stories could be multiplied, but time runs short. What do we have to learn from this? What can we learn from this? As I've immersed myself in the stories of these beautiful people, I'm struck with this. At the heart of the way of Jesus is fiery love for God and neighbor. Love God with your whole heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Which neighbor? The parable of the Good Samaritan, cited over and over again as deeply motivating for the rescuers of Le Chambon, makes it clear. My neighbor is anyone in need and in reach of my love. Anyone in need and in reach of my love. To be a follower of Jesus, to have taken on his yoke, to be his disciple, his apprentice, is to be someone in the process of being overwhelmed by this love, of being utterly possessed by it, of being willing to surrender all in pursuit of it. This is what Jesus spoke of when he said in Mark 8, if anyone wants to become my follower, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and for the gospel will save it. For what benefit is it for a person to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his life? What can a person gain in exchange for his life? To be a follower of Jesus, to be living in his way, is to have given up the things of the world, the things which so frequently allure us: honors, wealth, status, comforts, career success, house with a white picket fence, a comfortable retirement. To be captivated by Jesus and his way of love, his way of the cross, is to have renounced all this, left it behind, to be set on fire by love, to give oneself wholly to being an agent of shalom, bringing peace and healing wherever there is darkness. It's to have been utterly gripped by the preciousness in God's eyes of every human being. It's to give oneself to the idea that no one can be excluded from the shalom of God's kingdom. No one. It's to have taken on board the idea that we are our brother and sister's keeper. We are responsible for one another. We are accountable to God for the well-being of the weakest, most vulnerable among us. It's to be so on fire with the presence of Jesus, with the flood of his love into one's heart, that one can no longer be the rich man, habitually dressing in purple and fine linen in Jesus' parable, joyously living in splendor and day after day, while the cold, the hungry, the vulnerable, the persecuted, the downtrodden huddle on one's doorstep. It's to be so afire with the presence of Jesus, with the flood of his love into one's heart, that we can no longer be the goats of Matthew 25, who ignore Jesus in the guise of a hungry man, woman, or child, of which there are literally hundreds of thousands in this Los Angeles and Orange County area around us. It's to be such that we can no longer ignore Jesus in the guise of a homeless man or woman, of which there are literally hundreds of thousands in this Los Angeles and Orange County around us. It's to be such that we can no longer ignore Jesus in the guise of a prisoner suffering brutal and humiliating conditions of imprisonment, of which there are millions in our nation. It's to be such that we can no longer ignore Jesus in the guise of millions of undocumented immigrants in our midst who live in constant fear of arrest, degrading conditions of imprisonment, separation from their children, and deportment to foreign lands where too often they have no family, friends, or means of support. It's to give ourselves to love wholly, without reservation, without excuses, without fear, with joyous abandon. The people of Lou Chambon, Andre Trocmé, Edward Thies, they are our guides. They show us what it looks like to be all in love. Strange to say, but in a way, they had it easier than we do. They lived in a time of crisis when people literally arrived on their doorsteps in need of help. We live in normal times in which the plight of the vulnerable, the persecuted, the hungry in our midst has become normalized. It's part of everyday life, part of the way things are. But there are such people all around us by the millions, the desperately poor, the hungry, those brutalized by our prisons, by our immigration system. Every one of these brothers and sisters is precious in the eyes of our Abba. They are the ones who seek refuge in our midst. They are our unjustly persecuted, the ones we must take responsibility for. Live in love. It all comes down to this. Live in love. Renounce success, safety, respectability, upward mobility, and live in the precarity of all in love. That's the beautiful lesson of Lou Chambon, France. Such is the way of our precious Jesus.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.